Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow, which is why I sound a wee bit funny for an American and just in general. Now, my research is in the intellectual history of the US Constitution and how that history can be used to help us understand and address contemporary social and political issues, which we have more than a few of right now. Now, today, what I'd like to chat about is what we the people means. Those famous three words at the beginning of the US Constitution. They're powerful words. They're at the heart of the American story. And stories, whether of individuals or nations, have power because they shape and form our identity. And identities inform our actions. So collective identities, ideologies, inform collective actions, which, interestingly enough, is Hannah Arendt's definition of power in her political theory. Now, we can see this play out both at the US Capitol on January 6th, as well as in the No Kings protests. Both groups, despite their lack of overlap in demographics, ideology, much of anything it would seem, both seem to be driven to act out of what they believed was an alignment with those three words and what it means to be American, what we the people stands for. Now, you might ask, who's right? Now, what I'll do is give you some history, theory, and philosophy, but at the end of the day, I'm going to leave it up to you to decide, because hopefully, as you'll see, that's kind of the point of all of this, of we the people, of what it means to be an American. Now, we're going to look at these three words as it speaks to three important aspects of the United States. So the first is, what kind of government do we have? Because it's important to remember the US Constitution, first and foremost, is a plan of government. Second, we're going to look at how those words speak to our foundational values and principles. What makes us a we? What identifies us as American? And these two things raise a third philosophical question. Who counts as part of we? Who gets included in this term? Who gets to be an American? Who's part of the body politic, or what Dewey would call the public? Now, we're going to start with, what kind of government did we get? Now, you've probably heard the assertion that the United States is a republic as opposed to a democracy, which is a wee bit of making a mountain out of a molehill. I mean, we do have democratic republics, and they are a real thing. However, there was debate over those two terms in the 18th century, and as well as what kind of government we should create, and what kind of government the US Constitution actually did create. Now, during the Constitutional Convention was the debate over what kind of government should we make. But during the ratification debates, when the framers, those who wrote the US Constitution, many of whom became Federalists, those who supported the ratification or authorization of the US Constitution, had to explain what it was that they wrote down. What kind of government were we actually creating? And there was a lot of debate, both over what kind of government we should have, as well as what kind of government the US Constitution was going to create. As Gordon Wood argues, now he's a preeminent historian of the American Revolution and early Republic period, he argues that the framers, the people who wrote it, didn't realize how revolutionary a system of government they had created until they had to defend it during these ratification debates. So keep that in mind as we go through some of the history and some of the disagreements. So, when it comes to democracy, in the 18th century this was something of a dirty word. It was seen as akin to mob rule. And the Constitutional Convention itself was called or inspired by many of the founders who believed the country was suffering from what they called democratic despotism, this descent into mob rule. Now, likely this comes out of their reading of the classics like Plato and Aristotle. Plato saw democracy as the last step before tyranny. And Aristotle, on the other hand, recognized that all three pure forms of government could devolve or be corrupted into tyranny. And the founders understood this as well. Well, democracy itself was kind of a dirty word, as I said. All three forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, could easily devolve into tyrannical forms. Monarchy becomes what we might call an authoritarian dictatorship today. Aristocracy becomes an oligarchy, and democracy transforms into this fun word called ochlocracy. Now, the received wisdom of the time said the solution to this problem, this devolution into tyranny, is what's called mixed government. We take all three forms, pure forms of government, and we put them together into one government and try to balance each of them out, gaining the strengths of one form and diminishing the weaknesses at the same time, as well as preventing this devolution into tyranny. Now, at the time, the British Parliament was seen as epitomizing this, particularly the British Constitution. We have a king, the monarchy, we have the House of Lords, the aristocracy, and we have the House of Commons, the democracy part. The founders, even having fought a revolution against the British Empire, still thought this was the best form of government. Indeed, they fought the revolution in order to restore the British Constitution. They were fighting for their rights as Englishmen. Now, this went so far as in the Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton argued that we should simply recreate the British Constitution on American soil. Let's elect a king, let's set up an aristocracy. It might take 100 years for it to really take hold, but we may as well get started now because we've seen this is the best, most stable form of government. Now, luckily, Alexander Hamilton's proposal did not gain too much traction, but it illustrates how idealized and how prevalent this idea of mixed government was. Now, James Madison ameliorates this a little bit in his Federalist Papers. He says, particularly in Federalist number 10, which you might have read in high school, that the foundation of the U.S. Constitution is what he calls the Republican principle. Now, this idea is essentially representation, and representation as a means of filtering the public will so that only the best ideas become legislation and laws, and only the best people rise to the top to lead the country. Now, this is epitomized in the Senate, which he discusses in Federalist number 63. Originally, our senators here in the United States were elected by the state legislature, not by the people. This is that filtration process. A wee bit elitist, but we'll get to that in a later video. Now, James Wilson, also a framer and a Federalist, like Madison and Hamilton, he wanted the Constitution to be ratified, argued that it was founded on something different. Now, first, he helpfully tells us in the ratification debates, and I quote, "Then in its principles, it being the U.S. Constitution, it is purely democratical." Now, his idea here is not so much that the different branches represent different aspects of society, as they do in the British Constitution, but they mimic them in their function while still being democratic in the sense that they are appointed by the people. Because Wilson helpfully defines a republic and a democracy, what this democratical principle is. So he says a republic or a democracy, yes, he uses the terms interchangeably, is a form of government where, and I quote, "the people at large retain the supreme power and act either collectively or by representation." People have the power, and he believes that is the case in the U.S. Constitution. Now, Wilson becomes even more helpful and directly tells us what "we the people" means, that preamble, as well as the popular ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Because remember, the U.S. Constitution's acceptance was not a foregone conclusion. There was a political campaign, these ratification debates, to see whether or not the people would choose to be governed by the government created by the U.S. Constitution. So according to Wilson, what "we the people" means is this, I quote, "It is announced in their name. It receives its political existence from their authority. They ordain and establish. What is the necessary consequence? Those who ordain and establish have the power, if they think proper, to repeal and annul. So what that means is what he later defines as his revolution principle in his lectures on law. It means we, the people, are perpetually sovereign, and thus government requires our continuing consent to exist and govern. This means that the people can change their constitution or any aspect of their governance at any time and for any reason through a simple democratic vote. Pretty democratic, radically democratic, even by today's standards. Now, this wasn't just a theory. Arguably, Wilson saw this happen when the U.S. Constitution was indeed ratified by the people. As a legal scholar argues, this was the legal word made flesh. The Articles of Confederation, the existing government over the 13 states, was abolished, and the U.S. Constitution in this new federalist system was established through a simple democratic vote. This has happened. Now, which of these is correct? And who, by the way, is James Wilson? Don't feel bad if you haven't heard of him before. It took me going to the University of Edinburgh for my master's to find out that he existed. So James Wilson was one of 6 men to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Now, importantly, he likely helped pen those words, we the people. He might have even written them himself as part of the 5-member Committee of Detail, those 5 people tasked with writing everybody's ideas into one legal document, the U.S. Constitution. Now, he would go on to be one of the country's first Supreme Court justices and give one of the first lecture series on American law, which Aaron Knapp, another legal scholar, argues gave birth to American jurisprudence as such. Kind of the brains of the operation, even if James Madison, as many of you might know, is known as the father of the U.S. Constitution. I would argue they have joint custody, to put it nicely. However, this raises the question, who is right, or which interpretation? Well, the framers, founders, and certainly during the ratification debates, they disagreed not only on what went into the Constitution, why it was put in, but what it meant, the interpretation part. Madison argues his point in the Federalist Papers, Wilson argues his in the Pennsylvania ratification debates, and in his State House Yard speech. Whose was more influential? Well, you can read my thesis if you'd like to know that. Now, the one thing they did all agree on was that nobody was happy with this document. They all recognized that there were problems. There were mistakes, there were errors that future generations would have to fix. And Wilson argued not only fix the problems inherent in it, but he hoped that they would improve upon it to make an ever better government based on developments in knowledge and society. And the other thing they agreed on was, again, that while this is our job to fix and improve, it also means that, to varying degrees, we get to decide. That's what we the people means. We get to govern ourselves. We get to participate in how we're governed. We get to decide what those words mean, and with it who we want to be as a country. Which brings us to what kind of foundational values and principles these 3 words speak to. Well, if we think these words mean, or at least the founders to a certain extent agreed, that it means we get to decide, or at least be a part of the discussion about how we want to be governed, well, that sounds a wee bit like liberty to me, right? Especially in the 18th century. We get to govern ourselves. We are free because we govern ourselves. We get to decide on the laws and the rules. What is justice? So we could potentially simplify and summarize that with the last few words of the Pledge of Allegiance: liberty and justice for all. And to that, I might add this slightly progressive element, that we're continually looking to improve upon how we deliver on that promise of liberty and justice for all, to actually make a government where we are free, where we get to participate and decide. But this brings us to a question that is far more politically loaded, and that's that philosophical question of who counts as part of we. Now, how do we define this? Well, most simply, who gets to participate and how do we participate in the discussion about how we govern ourselves? Well, most simply, how we do this in a representational democracy is we vote. We vote on the people who decide on the legislation. In some states, we get to vote directly on the laws in referendums and things like that. So voting. So who gets to vote is an easy substitute for who's part of we. Now, the whole bit about liberty and justice for all was a pretty narrow term in the 18th century if we're comparing it to voting rights, or using voting rights as a substitution and a concrete manner of seeing who's part of this we. In the 18th century, it was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, over 21, who owned land or property, people who looked like me. Pretty narrow conception of who gets to be a part of this discussion. Now, thinking about that progress and improvement part, through the Reconstruction Amendments, the right to vote was extended to black men. And a sadly long time after that, it was also extended to women. Now we have universal suffrage over 18, in theory. Now I know in practice that's something different. And I think this idea of extending that promise of at least liberty reflects the American story. Now, the story I tell about the United States, and that I think is well laid out in American history, is this idea of continually trying to extend those promises of liberty and justice for all, those founding ideals, to an ever larger group of people and an ever fuller way. So we could look at this not only in extending the vote, but in labor rights and things of that variety, different aspects of our life. We can see this in the Marriage Equality Act. Different groups are allowed to more fully participate in society and be protected by the law, receive justice. Now, you might go, Dr. Peters, have you seen the news? Have you actually read American history? What about the genocide and the slavery and the internment camps and the atrocities done to people in the civil rights movement, the Jim Crow South, what happened to the suffragettes? The list goes on. I haven't ignored them, and I haven't forgotten them. My question in return is a question of framing. Do those sins, mistakes, failures, atrocities define what it means to be American? Or does the civil rights movement and then the civil rights acts, does that define what it means to be American? Does the extension of the vote define what it means to be American? Do we uphold Confederate generals with statues? Or do we praise and remember the Irish immigrants fresh off the boat who fought for the Union to end slavery? The question is, which is the exception and which is the rule? And which do we decide to see as the exception and the rule? Now, like I said, I think history is on my side, that the story of the United States is extending these founding promises to more people and in more ways. But as Hannah Arendt would argue, it doesn't matter that I can potentially prove these ideas of Americanness wrong. She argues that in 1930s Germany, many historians argue that the Nazis' portrayal of the founding myth of Germany was historically incorrect. That didn't stop World War II, didn't stop the rise of Hitler, it didn't stop the Holocaust. Now, what I would add to that is that bad stories, bad ideas, bad ideologies are rarely argued out of existence. They're more often replaced by something more inspiring and often more positive, something that brings us together to construct something. And even more importantly, I would say that at the end of the day, it really is up to us which of these stories we want to tell. How do we want to frame our history? Because whichever way we choose to frame it, to tell it to ourselves, it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we keep telling ourselves the bigotry and the racism is the rule, is what it means to be American, we will get more of it. If we tell a more positive story of progress, of extending these promises, of trying to make good on them, not only will we start to construct a better future, a better country, a better government, it will start to reshape our identity in a way that allows us to recognize, acknowledge, and address some of these errors and sins. Imagine that. What if our country, what if it meant to be American, was to acknowledge and deal with our own mistakes in our history, to make good on them, to make a better future for everyone? It's a country I'd like to live in. And that brings me to the point of this channel. I want to start a conversation about what kind of country do we want? What do we want we the people to stand for? What do we want it to mean to be American? Because as the founders, I think, accurately put forward, we get to decide. And we need to start having a conversation about this. Because simply saying something is wrong is not necessarily going to fix it. By all means, call out injustice. But let's also imagine what kind of country we want to live in, what kind of country we want to create, what kind of country we want to leave behind. Because I believe that that will inspire us to actually make a difference. We'll know what we're aiming for. And so with that, if you're interested in that conversation of starting to imagine what that future can look like, a future that might inspire us to even more action, more community, more justice, more just better things, a country we can be proud of again, then please, by all means, comment and stay tuned for more videos about American history and how it can be used to help us understand today and try to make a better future tomorrow. And with that, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good evening.